Today we're going to continue our look into Greece with Chapter 5, Section 2, which is going to talk about how the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta were made up and how eventually they went to war. And then at the end of the section, it also talks about the Persian Wars, which is where the Greeks were invaded by the ancient Persians. Roman numeral 1 says rule and order in Greek city-states. This is a few of the ins and outs of how the Greek city-states were ordered. First of all, capital A is a key term called polis. Polis literally means city-state. It was the fundamental political unit in ancient Greece. Basically, when you think of a polis, you're thinking about a city and its surrounding countryside. Generally, you had 50 to 500 square miles of territory covered by a city-state, and usually in Greece, close to about 10,000 residents. The Acropolis was a major part of almost every Greek city-state. It was a fortified hilltop area where citizens would meet and gather to discuss city government. Now, some of the Greek political structures that you're going to need to know are extremely important. Now, where there's going to be a lot of key terms in this section, as you can see. Number 1 is monarchy. Monarchy is something that we've already talked about this year. It's very simple. It's ruled by a single person, such as a king or a queen. Number 2 is aristocracy. An aristocracy is ruled by a small group of noble landowning families. Now, when you're talking about aristocracy, you're talking about very wealthy groups of families that own a lot of land. And you bring 4 or 5 of those families together and they rule the city-state. Now, number 3 is similar, but little different than aristocracy. It's called an oligarchy. An oligarchy is where there's rule by a few powerful individual people. So you still have multiple rulers, but you're talking about a few powerful individuals. Capital letter D is a special circumstance called tyrants. Tyrants are usually powerful individuals, sometimes a military general or a warrior. They could also be nobles or wealthy landowners. They could at times take control of the government, seize control of the government, you could say, by appealing to the common people for support. Now, this definition has a different connotation today. Today, we think of a tyrant as a very negative thing. In the ancient times, a tyrant was simply someone who had the support of the people. Maybe if you're in a school setting and you want change, you might say, I think we should not have a dress code, or I think we should be able to use our phones in class. Well, somebody steps up and says, yeah, I agree with that. Why don't you guys come follow me? And then everybody in the entire student body is saying, oh, yeah, I like this guy. He's willing to fight for us. And he goes to the administration. He says, yeah, I think we should have cell phones, And, people are like, yeah, we agree too. Eventually, what happens is he gets enough support that he can take control and overthrow the government. It sometimes is referred to in later societies as a coup d'etat, which is a military overthrow. Roman numeral 2 is going to dive into Athens, the key Greek city-state. When you think about Athens, you want to associate them with democracy and the onsets of early democracy. Democracy is literally rule by the people. Demoskratia, people rule. And representative government is what this is called. It began to be used by some city-states. In Athens, citizens participated in direct political decision-making through voting. The way that this started is they had 2 large canisters. They look like basically garbage cans, and they had a big stack of rocks. And you had issues, maybe yes or no issues, or maybe voting for 2 candidates. And you would get in a line and you'd pick a rock. And as you walked through the line, there'd be a canister on the left, canister on the right. Each one would have a certain value to it, and you would put your rock into that canister. So that's if there was more rocks in the left canister that stood for yes, fewer rocks in the right canister that stood for no, then the answer was going to be yes. That's how democracy basically began, through political decision-making, through voting rights. Capital B is going to talk about some of the key figures who built democracy. First of all is Draco. Draco was a nobleman. He took power in 621 BC, so he's wealthy and he has power and land. He developed a legal code that was based on the idea that all Athenians were equal under the law. Very strict. Death was the punishment for nearly every crime, and people who were in debt to others were forced into what's called debt slavery until they could pay off their debts. This was a very strict code. Today, if we use the word draconian, it's a reference to this Greek nobleman Draco. means very strict, very harsh punishments, things of that nature. Solon was next as a key builder of democracy. These guys don't go in order, but he was the next key figure that we want to know. Came to power in 594. One of the first things that he did is he got rid of debt slavery. He then organized all Athenian citizens into 4 social classes according to wealth. So this is kind of the start of districting. So he starts to put people organized by where they live, essentially, or how much money they make. Then you have Cleisthenes coming into play around 500 BC, a little bit later. He introduced further democratic reforms. He actually organized people into 10 groups based on where they lived rather than just their wealth, which is kind of what we do today. But a lot of times where you live is predicated on your wealth and vice versa. He also created what's called the Council of the 500. It's a group or body of people chosen at random to propose laws and then counsel the assembly. The reforms of Cleisthenes allowed Athenian citizens to participate in a limited democracy. Citizenship was limited to only free adult male property owners that were born in Athens. So unfortunately, if you didn't meet that criteria, you were not considered a citizen, and that's why it's called limited democracy. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded from citizenship and thus had very few rights. Athenian education was generally something that was in play, but it was restricted to only the sons of wealthy families. You had to pay a lot of money to get an education. Schooling for these lucky individuals began at age 7, and the goal was to prepare young boys to become good citizens. That is still the goal of education, is to create knowledgeable citizens so that they can make educated votes. The curriculum included was reading, grammar, poetry, history, math, music, logic, and public speaking. This is very similar to what we have today. Part of each day was spent toward athletic training. When the boys got older, they transferred that athletic training into military training. Girls, unfortunately, did not attend school and were educated at home in the arts of child rearing, weaving of clothing, preparing meals, and other skills deemed and believed to help them become good wives and mothers. So, where Athens was very democratic, focused on education, focused on the arts, intellect, Sparta was the exact opposite. Sparta was focused on straight military preparation. One of the things about this, they had kind of an early scare. In 725, Sparta actually conquered their neighbor, which was called Messenia. And they forced the people in that region into a state of slavery, and they called them Helots. Helots were peasants that were forced to stay on the land that they worked, sort of like a serf. Each year, the Spartans demanded 1/2 of the Helots' crops. That's quite a significant amount. In 650 BC, the Messenians then rebelled. They led a slave revolt, and they outnumbered the Spartans 8-1. The Spartans barely defeated this revolt, and this caused them to develop a state of constant military preparation. Next is Spartan government and society. Basically, they had an assembly which was composed of all the Spartan citizens. This assembly elected officials and voted on major issues. They had what's called the Council of the Elders, which was 30 older citizens. They proposed laws on which the assembly would then vote. They had 5 elected officials that would carry out the laws passed by the assembly, and 2 kings that ruled over Sparta's military forces. One king would take the army away on conquests. One would be in charge of the army back at home. When there was no war going on, they were both in charge of defense. Overall, Sparta is an example of a oligarchy, which is a form of government in which power rests with a small elite group of individual rulers. Spartan daily life was pretty harsh. From 600 to 371 BC, Sparta did have the most powerful army in Greece. The most powerful navy was probably handled by the Athenians. The Spartans did not value things like the arts or literature or other artistic and intellectual pursuits, but they did value things like duty, strength, discipline, over more Athenian democratic values of individuality, beauty, and learning. Men were expected to serve in the military until the age of 60. That would be pretty much your whole life. Boys would leave home at the age of 7, and they lived in the army barracks until they were about 30. Training was pretty harsh, but it did produce tough, resourceful soldiers. Spartan women were also trained in military and were expected to be pretty strong and tough. Roman numeral 4 talks briefly about the Persian Wars. Now, one of the things to note is that the advancement from bronze to iron led to larger army sizes. Here's the key with that. See, when you have bronze, you have to mix copper and tin, so you have to find a lot of different elements in nature to bring it together. Iron, you basically melt the iron off of the ore, which is like a rock formation, and so it's more commonly found in nature and therefore cheaper. Armies back then, you had to buy your own weapons, so once you have iron, it becomes cheaper, it becomes more commonly available, so you have your army being made up of both rich and poor men. Now, the Spartans called their foot soldiers hoplites, and they created this side-by-side, shoulder-to-shoulder shield and spear formation called the Phalanx. It was a compact group of soldiers that fought in very good rank and order and discipline. These became very crucial in the Persian Wars, where the Persians were invading and highly outnumbered the Greek soldiers. One of the famous battles is the Battle of Marathon. Starts off the Persian Wars, which were between the Greeks and the Persians, of course. It began in Ionia on the coast of Anatolia, where certain Greek peoples had settled there, and the Persians were not very happy about this. The Persians conquered the area in 546 BC. The Persian ruler at the time was Darius the Great. He vowed to destroy Athens in response to the Athenians who aided a Ionian revolt against Persia. The Battle of Marathon is a small village outside of Athens. In 490 BC, the Persians brought over about 25,000 men and invaded the outside regions of Athens. The Athenians had arranged themselves ready for battle in 10,000 neatly arranged soldiers specializing in phalanx formation. The Persians were not very well trained. They had very light armor. They really were no match for the Athenian phalanx. In the first few hours of the battle, the Persians retreated after losing 6,000 men. The Athenians had only suffered about 200 casualties. The story about this is kind of interesting. It involves a runner and a messenger named Phidippides. He was a young runner chosen to race back to Athens and inform the citizens of the Greek victory. Athens was undefended at this time because the entire army was on the battlefield at Marathon. So Phidippides ran the 26.2 miles from the farming village of Marathon to Athens. It is said that he delivered his message, "Rejoice, we conquer." He then later collapsed and died from the exhaustion. The Athenian army, though, then raced back to Athens behind Phidippides and eventually made it in time to Athens to fortify and turn back the remaining Persians who were once again attacking. Some other battles to research that are interesting is the Battle of Thermopylae, which took place 10 years later. It's between the Spartans. It's known as the 300 Spartans versus an onslaught of Persians. It's what the movie The 300 is all about. You have the Battle of Salamis, which was a very important battle fought at sea. It's a naval battle in which a key Athenian leader named Themistocles defended against a Persian attack by Xerxes, in which more than 1/3 of Xerxes' fleet was destroyed. The final major battle of the Persian Wars was Plataea in 479 BC. It was a great Greek victory which sent the Persians into a constant state of defense for the remainder of the Persian Wars and even into the time in which Alexander the Great conquered. Due to these invasions by the Persians, many of the Greek city-states came together in what's called the Delian League. It was several Greek city-states that formed an alliance to fight off and protect Greece from the Persians. Athens became the headquarters of the Delian League, which eventually included over 200 city-states. One city-state that did not stay in the Delian League was Sparta, and that's going to lead us into Section 3, which is going to talk about the Peloponnesian War, which was a major war between Athens and Sparta.